Okay, so today we're going to take a look at conservatism, particularly conservatism in the Anglo-American tradition of conservatism. Of course, there are other traditions on the European continent and elsewhere in the world, but looking at the UK and the US helps us understand how a common heritage can still produce a variety of distinct conservative ideologies. Now, let's start further back in history. In a world rife with revolution and war, the British and American political systems have enjoyed exceptional political stability over the past 2 centuries. They trace a common ancestry to the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and 1689, when Parliament in the UK became the central element of British government, not the Crown. Both nations, the UK and the US, favor a division of powers, and both value the existence of an independent judiciary. Both recognize citizens' rights and limits on government authority, and both are responsive to popular opinion. Britons and Americans alike, inventive and entrepreneurial peoples, have prospered materially and enjoyed ever-rising standards of living under these conditions. So it's no wonder that influential writers and politicians in both societies have sought to preserve these advantages against internal and external threats, and have feared that injudicious changes might worsen rather than improve their situation. Our collective name for such men and women is conservatives. Conservatism is, above all, an attitude about the world, which sees the past as the best guide for navigating our way into the future. It assumes that all the really important questions confronting humanity have already been answered, and that it is generally safest to stick with what is tried and true. Blueprints for transforming society, say conservatives, will not work. They do not pay sufficient heed to the complexity of human nature, and their unforeseen side effects can easily do more harm than the good they intend. Conservatives tend to be skeptical about the possibility of human perfection. Even those who are not religious understand the wisdom embodied in the idea of original sin, that we are all capable of evil as well as good. Conservatives think of imperfect human nature as the bedrock of social and political reality. It may seem different under different social and cultural conditions, but it never changes in its essentials. For example, war, to conservatives, is a permanent and inevitable part of the human condition. The sensible policy, say conservatives, is always to prepare for war, and do what you can to then avoid it. Woodrow Wilson said that World War I was the war to end all wars, and that its end would make the world safe for democracy. This is exactly the sort of claims that conservatives do not make. Woodrow Wilson, of course, was no conservative. Conservatives tend to be skeptical about the powers of human rationality, which doesn't always make conservatives religious, but it makes them more trusting of tradition and collective wisdom than individual thought, rationality, or philosophy. There are not a lot of systematic conservative philosophers because many conservatives do not put as much stock in rationally justifying political institutions. Instead, conservatives will say, look at the wisdom of tried and true political practice and tradition. Mess with it at your own peril. Rights and authority and justice for conservatives are shaped by political practice. In that sense, many political conservatives are moral relativists of a sort. The right answers are the ones that society has worked out over time, and that have stood the test of time. New answers, therefore, are always viewed with suspicion or even hostility. John Stuart Mill once called conservatives the stupid party. They reject innovation and new ideas. And of course, when conservatism is just a defense of privilege by the privileged, it's not very interesting or glorious to be conservative. But at its very best, conservatism has attracted the brightest political minds of the past 2 centuries. Conservatism in the Anglo-American tradition has usually been what we call reactive. Conservatives do not favor a general plan for society, and conservatives in different eras usually valued the world as they found it. And then they reacted to what they perceived as threats confronting it. That's why they're reactive. It's therefore no paradox that at different times conservatives have argued for many different sorts of policies. One example where conservatives have changed their views by and large is on the subject of the free market and capitalism. In the days of Adam Smith, the free market economy was a radical project that many conservatives deplored, whereas in recent decades, preservation of the free market has been a central conservative concern. Some prominent features in the conservative tradition, including Alexander Hamilton in the United States and William Pitt on the English side of the Atlantic, favored increasing the powers of central governments, while others, like Herbert Hoover or Margaret Thatcher, favored restricting the reach of a central government. Some, like Winston Churchill and Theodore Roosevelt, were empire builders, whereas others, like Robert Taft and Edward Heath, rejected the idea of colonizing other parts of the world. Nearly all conservatives before 1850 denied the assertion of human equality and doubted that democracy was compatible with a healthy society. But by the early 21st century, virtually all Anglo-American conservatives were committed to the principle of universal democracy. Conservatism, like we said, has been associated with free markets. This is, of course, a more recent development because at the time that they were first imagined, free markets were a radical idea. But the basic idea behind capitalism, that individual self-interest can lead to beneficial social outcomes, is very much in line with conservative views on the unchangingness and general selfishness of human nature. So conservatives are therefore often supportive of free markets as a way of reconciling private and social interest. Another reason many conservatives have come to support the free market is that they view society as a complex organism. There is a biological metaphor here that's quite powerful. After all, if you modify one part of a complex organism, that's going to have unpredictable effects on the whole. And this is a good analogy to what happens when you interfere too much with free markets and tradition in general. You don't know what genie you are letting out of the bottle. And of course, you could extend the metaphor to environmental systems, and some conservatives are indeed environmentalists on those grounds. They understand the logic that complex systems are not to be changed when they're functioning really or reasonably well because of the unpredictable effects that such changes could have. But conservatism has always had a love-hate relationship with markets, because nothing has done more to change the world and upset traditional ways of doing things than capitalism. The market is dynamic and does more than anyone or anything to undermine existing centers of economic power and stability. This leads to the perennial complaint that the buying and selling of everything tends to lead to the downfall of civilization. And of course, this means that conservatives often call for limits on market activities. Conservatism appeals to that part of the human nature that distrusts change and likes stability and order. From a very early age, we become attached to people, places, and things, and find it difficult and painful to let go. Conservatives tend to value loyalty to the existing order when it's tolerable, and want to approach change gradually, taking into account the costs of violating people's long-standing settled expectations. Unsurprisingly, conservatives often argue that change is just not worth the costs. Conservatism therefore always counsels patience over perfectionism. The world and its people are never going to be perfect, and attempts to make it perfect may backfire spectacularly. So despite some of the general philosophical similarities between conservatives around the world, nonetheless, I think we can say confidently that there's some big policy differences between conservatives all over the world. Let me give you some examples. In the United States, conservative politicians would boast often that they hunt. But in the United Kingdom, this would be a major faux pas. Hunting is viewed as an aristocratic pursuit, one that would not mesh very, very well with democratic politics. Similarly, it's difficult to be a conservative politician in the United States and not be religious and make claims about one's religious observance. But in England, you'd be thought of as a bit of a crackpot if you brought religion into politics. British conservatives also do not oppose abortion, and they support the National Health Service, whereas American conservatives tend to be against abortion and socialized healthcare. British conservatives also see no reason why individuals should be permitted to own handguns, while their American counterparts tend to be staunchly in favor of handguns. Now, what's interesting about these policy differences is that it helps us sort out the sorts of things that are essential to what conservatism is about, and those elements that are more historically contingent or not particularly central to the idea of conservatism. It tells us that conservatism cares about tradition, stability, and order, but not necessarily any specific traditions or types of order, as long as the change happens fairly gradually, and as long as they recognize the reality of human nature and the unchangingness of fundamental human conditions. So although liberals and reformers view conservatism as a rigid philosophy, this is actually a testimony to the flexibility of the conservative worldview in face of changed circumstances, and explains in part, no doubt, why conservatism has survived while rival ideologies like communism and fascism and other rigid ideologies have faded away.